Good evening, everybody. Hope your week is treating you well and everything is going good for you, and you're staying warm, you're staying healthy, and all the above. As kind of a follow-up from last week's video, I'd suggested being able to go through and pray over the names of God. I hope that you've done that. Definitely, and will always believe that that is a beautiful way of just not only being able to pray, but it increases the connection, and I believe the bond of how we address God, how we see God and view Him, and just even as the New Testament portrays, my sheep will know my voice. Hopefully it has helped to at least gain a little bit of a deeper side of saying, God, I feel closer to you. And so I hope that was well for you, or went well for you, and if you hadn't done it, shame on you, right? But nevertheless, this evening we're going to jump off into Daniel chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 24 through 35. And in essence, we're going to just kind of hit the highlights this week. I don't want to dive off into the interpretation stuff because that'll kind of be in the following video for next week. But at least for tonight, we're going to kind of get that beginning phase of what exactly Daniel is relaying to King Nebuchadnezzar. So in verse 24 of Daniel chapter 2, it says, "Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had assigned to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He came and said to him, 'Don't kill the wise men of Babylon. Bring me before the king, and I will give him the interpretation.' Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said to him, 'I have found a man among the Judean exiles who can let the king know the interpretation.' And the king said in reply to Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, 'Are you able to tell me the dream I had and its interpretation?' And pay attention and kind of listen carefully to this. It says, 'Daniel answered the king, no wise man, medium, diviner, priest, or astrologer is able to make known to the king the mystery he has asked about. But,' in verse 28, you got to love those conjunctions, 'but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has let the king Nebuchadnezzar know what will happen in the last days. Your dream and the visions that came into your mind as you lay in bed were these. Your Majesty, while you were in your bed, thoughts came to your mind about what will happen in the future. The revealer of mysteries has let you know what will happen. And as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but in order that the interpretation might be made known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. My king, as you were watching, a colossal statue appeared. And that statue, tall and dazzling, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was terrifying. The head of the statue was pure gold, its chest and its arms were silver, its stomach and thighs were bronze, and its legs were iron, and its feet were partly iron and partly fired clay. And as you were watching, a stone broke off without a hand touching it, struck the statue on its feet of iron and fired clay and crushed them." And then in verse 35 it says, "Then the iron, the fired clay, the bronze and the silver and the gold were shattered and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away. Not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So here, I want to kind of just briefly discuss it in two different sections almost. The first half is more or less Daniel kind of going before the king, and then we'll discuss the dream side of it. So in verse 24 through 30 there, you can see there on your screen, Daniel told Arioch to not kill the wise men. I think that that's extremely wonderful. It is very much so a side of humility and trust even in God, of being able to think through the circumstances and the situation to which Daniel was walking in. But as you notice, kind of going from verses 24 into 26, or 25 and 26, you kind of see this interaction of Arioch with Nebuchadnezzar of who I have found. Notice what he says there in verse 26. In verse 25, he said, "Don't kill the wise," or I'll find it in a second. Verse 25. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said to him, I have found a man among the Judean exiles who can let the king know this interpretation. So there again, you can kind of see, and Arioch's announcements was potentially prideful. There was hopeful, even in his voice, a hopefulness of saying, hopefully I don't have to kill anybody today. And so there's definitely a lot that is going on within this this time frame. You can see there, no wise man could fulfill this mission. But verse 28 specifies the God of heaven who reveals secrets. And I find that so important. Why? Because in essence, what was Nebuchadnezzar believing in? What was their religions and their theologies and everything else? It was all pagan. So in essence, what you're saying, or what you're seeing, is as Daniel's saying, there's no diviner priest, there's no soothsayers, there's no, astrologers, mediums, all of these people, nobody is able to do this. But then he kind of juxtaposes that with this ability to say, but there's a God in heaven. There again, I love that conjunction. But the God of heaven is able to do all these things. So there again, Daniel is being, I would say, strategically intentional about not only his witness, but about the testimony of God and the salvation of God. What God is capable and able to do in all things. And so there's definitely kind of an inserted condemnation from Daniel here to, and not that it's in direct opposition to the king, but it's kind of one of those things like, well, king, you fall into this category. Of course, nothing's going to work out for you because you don't know the right person. You don't have the faith. You don't have the belief in the right individual, that is, in God himself. And so, again, it hits the importance of relying upon God in order to deliver needs. So there again, Daniel is doing a lot. He's kind of intervening in a different way, but he is relaying to Nebuchadnezzar now in verses 28 and 29 there, kind of you're seeing the future. He acknowledges he doesn't fully know what the scenarios are going to look like, but he's saying into the future is what you're seeing. And king, it doesn't look good. There's an issue. There's a problem. That's the reason why you are struggling to accept what is happening and going on. And so as I've kind of told you over the last few weeks, to remember what not only this vision was going to look like, it's kind of, there's different analogies and imagery that is used throughout the course of the study of Daniel that relates to the same kind of just empirical breakdown. But nevertheless, as you can see on the screen there, this is just kind of a basic understanding of kind of how we're going to move forward. And not that I'm saying I want you to memorize this, but I think it would be highly advantageous for you to consider if you want to know and understand what kind of goes on through the book of Daniel. This image is going to help to kind of ingrain that into your mind. And so just real briefly, I want to go over that. Of course, the very top of it, Daniel goes into verses 31 through 35. Kind of relaying, you saw this image, potentially even the one that Nebuchadnezzar erects in chapter 3, verse 1. He builds a 90-foot tall statue there. This is potentially what he is referring to here as he is building this. But with that, there was the head of gold, which ultimately is going to point towards the empire of the Babylonians. Then you have the chest and the arms of silver there. That is going to point to the Medes and the Persians. That is the empire that comes directly after the Babylonians. In the belly and the thighs of the bronze there in the middle section, you see that that is going to be the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great, all of that. That is eventually going to be the third world power of this dream. And then you have two more. You have the legs of iron that you can see. That is the Roman Empire that occurred right after the Greek Empire. I believe that ended up falling in about 400 AD, if I'm not mistaken. But nevertheless, that is the Roman Empire. And then you have the feet of iron and clay there towards the bottom. That represents future powers. So whenever I say future powers, what I want you to be cognizant of is that that is where I believe in one of the very first things that I said in terms of the background of Daniel. In order to understand the background of Daniel, you have to have kind of a working knowledge of the rest of Scripture, because this is where portions of the book of Revelation get into. While we're not going to dive into that specifically here, we will get to all that later on and how it's all kind of interwoven together. But for the moment right now, we need to understand that within this vision of what we're about to look at and delve off into, there is a future side of the Roman kingdom, is typically what is agreed upon by most conservative scholars, that is coming into the future before the return of Christ, or there in the midst of, as we think through whether you're a premillennial dispensationist or you're a mid-trib rapture individual. Trying to bring in some of those viewpoints together is ultimately how these things are going to be fleshed out. And so, but from that side of it, there again, just a brief synopsis of it. You know, there are the future powers, but then you'll find there in verse 33 through 35 that you have this rock that is mentioned, and it basically symbolizes God's kingdom. That is what God is able to do. You know, there again, all kingdoms, all leaders, all rulers will one day find themselves under the submission of God Almighty. And in essence, that's kind of the culminating factor of that rock, is to display and show the ultimate power of God. So the reason why I say that, in verses 33 through 35 there, based on this rock, you can see that it was supernatural in terms of how it was formulated and come together. It talks about how it was cut out of the rock without human hands. So it was something that, in essence, Nebuchadnezzar, he is looking at, and I don't want to say it just kind of appears, but it doesn't really come with any specific person, or, you know, like with the kingdom in mind. It is something completely and totally different than the rest. We know that it had extraordinary power. As you go back up into verses 33 and 34 there, it says, its legs were iron and its feet were partly iron and partly fired clay. And as you were watching, a stone broke off without a hand touching it, struck the statue on its feet of iron and fired clay, and crushed them. Then the iron and the fired clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were shattered and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor. So, considering we're talking about extraordinary power, whenever this stone crushes the statue, it's like it turns it into powder, okay? So this rock hitting the statue is done with extreme force, in essence of saying it's going to annihilate it. It's going to wipe it off. It's not going to be survivable as far as that goes. There again, it's depicting that this rock has so much power that it cannot recover, to which, of course, if you understand in the book of Revelation, what the apocalypse looks like, and the Parousia, the end time events, the second coming of Christ, and all these things, you would probably recognize or know. We're discussing, what does that millennial reign look like? We're talking those moments that are a precursor into that reign of Christ. Whenever you're seeing the Antichrist, whenever you're seeing literally the 3.5 years of good and the 3.5 years of bad, the tribulation, all these different things, you're kind of looking at this restoration and this resetting of what the world is going to look like based on that time. But notice there, that last and final part of it there, it filled the whole earth. So there again, it wasn't just going to be a small location, but in essence, it was going to be everywhere. It was going to be a mountain that was found within all of these things. And so, like I said, I don't want to dive off too deeply into the meaning of all these things, and I want to save that kind of for the future lectures to come, and just as we're thinking through about how all this is put together. But either way, I want to encourage you, just briefly look at that image, okay? Study it, think about it, and kind of let that permeate and come into your mind, because of the fact that whenever it comes down to it, what you're going to be doing and what you're thinking about is ultimately the rest of the book of Daniel, plus as it relates to the end time events. But from there, we'll get off into the vision of everything and the interpretation next week. But I guess until then, I hope y'all have a great and wonderful week, and we'll talk to y'all later. See you guys.